A young woman headed home after a night out with friends, but she never made it. At first, no one could have imagined what happened, but as soon as police got involved, the case took a completely unexpected turn, one that made this investigation truly unique. And yet, despite having a mountain of evidence, detectives struggled to crack it. But in the end, they found a missing piece, and justice was finally served. Jessika Lynn Kalaher was born on May 8, 1982, in Austin, Texas. She lived there with her parents and two brothers until the family later moved to a small town called Pflugerville. Jessika was warm, friendly, and easy to get along with. Making friends came naturally to her. But she wasn't just social, she was also incredibly driven. Even in high school, she had a clear goal. She wanted to be a teacher. To make that dream a reality, she enrolled at Texas State University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in science. But she didn't stop there. Jessika decided to continue her education and work toward a master's degree. At the same time, she took a job as a teaching assistant at an elementary school. On top of that, she worked part-time at a grocery store. With student loans to pay off and bills stacking up, she had no choice but to juggle multiple jobs. But even with her packed schedule, she never lost her positive spirit. Jessika believed that all the hard work would eventually pay off, and she was determined to make it happen. In September 2009, at 27 years old, Jessika was still balancing her studies with two jobs. She was hopeful that soon she'd land a full-time teaching position at her school and finally focus on the career she had always dreamt of. On September 7th, Jessika had the day off, so she spent it with her friends and her cousin, Melanie. They started the day by hanging out at the pool, then went out for dinner. Later, they stopped by a bar, played some pool, and when the night wrapped up, Jessika took on the role of designated driver, making sure everyone got home safely. Melanie was the last one she dropped off. By then, it was almost 1:30 in the morning. She offered Jessika to stay the night, but Jessika declined. She had an early shift at the grocery store and needed to stop by a 24-hour store to grab some food for her dogs. So, after saying goodbye to her cousin, she headed out. A few hours later, as morning approached, Melanie got a call from one of Jessica's coworkers. She told her that Jessika hadn't shown up for her shift, which was pretty strange because Jessika had never skipped work without a good reason. Plus, by that time, she had been promoted to store manager, which meant even more responsibility. Melanie started to worry and called a few friends, but none of them had heard from Jessika that morning. Next, she reached out to her brother John. He and Jessika shared an apartment, but he told her he hadn't seen her either. John worked as a police officer and had started his shift at 5:30 a.m. He hadn't noticed whether Jessika had come home during the night and hadn't checked her room before leaving for work. Concerned, he immediately drove back home, but Jessika wasn't there. In fact, it didn't even look like she had returned the night before. Her dogs were acting strangely, almost as if they hadn't been fed in a while. That set off alarms. Something was definitely wrong. Without wasting any time, John reached out to his colleagues at the police department, asking them to track Jessica's phone. Following the signal, police traced it to a restaurant not far from her home. Melanie and her boyfriend rushed to the location, and it didn't take long for them to spot Jessica's car in the parking lot. But as soon as they got closer and opened the door, they were met with a horrifying sight. Jessika was in the driver's seat, completely unresponsive. Her body was covered in visible sunburns, and inside the car, it was unbearably hot. Melanie's boyfriend called the police, who dispatched officers and an ambulance to the scene. Paramedics confirmed that Jessika was dead, and her body was sent for further examination. But one thing was already clear. It looked like she'd been attacked. Meanwhile, investigators began examining Jessica's car, and one of the first things they noticed was that the driver's seat was pushed way too far back. Considering the injuries on her body, detectives suspected she might have been attacked right there in the car. They also discovered that her keys, wallet, and credit cards were missing. On the back seat, they found a bag of dog food, suggesting that Jessika had been there since the night before. After all, she had planned to stop at the store right after dropping off her cousin. After thoroughly searching the car, detectives went into the restaurant near the parking lot where Jessica's car had been found. And that's when things took a shocking turn. One of the restaurant employees told investigators that when she arrived at work early that morning, she noticed Jessika's car, but at that time, Jessika was still alive. According to the witness, Jessika was sitting inside her car completely undressed and acting strangely, almost as if she was under the influence. Despite how bizarre the scene was, the employee didn't think much of it and went inside to start her shift. A little while later, she stepped outside again. This time, Jessika was sitting next to her car. She had put her clothes back on, but was still behaving oddly, just sitting there, running her hands through her hair. The third time the employee went outside, Jessika was back in her car, talking to herself and making strange hand gestures. Police found several more witnesses who had seen Jessika alive that morning, but despite her unusual behavior, not a single person called for help or even checked to see if she was okay. After speaking with the witnesses, detectives went back to Melanie and asked if Jessika could have been under the influence of alcohol or something stronger. But her cousin was adamant Jessika had been completely sober that night. She was the designated driver, responsible for getting everyone home safely, and she had work in the morning. As for drugs, Melanie insisted that Jessika had never touched them in her life. None of it made sense to investigators, but soon they stumbled upon a possible explanation for what had happened. Medical examiners found signs of strangulation on Jessika's body, marks left by both hands and some kind of material, possibly a rope or a belt. She was also covered in bruises and scratches, and she had been sexually assaulted. According to experts, the trauma she endured could have caused a brain injury, which was only made worse by the fact that she had spent hours sitting inside a hot car under the scorching sun. This might explain her strange behavior, why she seemed disoriented and never called for help. Most likely, Jessika was so out of it that she didn't even realize what was happening to her, and in the end, she succumbed to her injuries. Toxicology reports backed up what her cousin had already said. There was no alcohol or drugs in her system. So, if just one of the witnesses had called for medical help, doctors might have had a chance to save Jessika. But now, it was too late, and detectives had to figure out who was responsible for her death. They focused on finding CCTV footage, but there were no cameras near the parking lot where Jessika had been found. Still, they figured out one thing. If she had bought dog food in the middle of the night, she had probably stopped at the 24-hour Walmart just across the street. Detectives obtained the store's security footage, and there she was, Jessika pulling into the parking lot and walking inside. She was alone and seemed completely fine. There were no signs that anything was wrong. She went straight to the pet food aisle, grabbed a large bag, and headed to the checkout. Everything looked normal, but then, as she walked out of the store, detectives noticed something interesting. Just a few seconds later, a man followed her outside. Reviewing more footage, detectives saw that the man had arrived at Walmart just minutes before Jessika. He parked at the far end of the lot and walked inside, but instead of going into the store, he headed straight to the restroom and then walked back out. Checking the entrance camera, detectives saw him walking directly behind Jessika, and he was definitely in a hurry. But then they hit a problem. Jessika's car was parked right behind a large tree, completely blocking the view from the cameras. Still, the footage was enough to track the man's movements. He walked toward Jessika's car, disappearing behind the tree, and never came back out. 2 minutes later, Jessika's car pulled out of the parking lot. Another camera later captured it arriving at the restaurant parking lot where she would be found the next morning. A little while later, someone stepped out of Jessika's car. This person walked across the lot, heading straight for Walmart's parking area, where he got in the same vehicle the suspicious man had arrived in earlier. At this point, detectives were almost certain this person was directly involved in Jessika's murder. But there was one problem. The surveillance footage was too poor to clearly identify him or his vehicle. Still, detectives weren't out of options. Since Jessika's credit cards were missing, they checked her accounts for any recent activity. And that's when they found a lead. One of her cards had been used at a gas station about 20 minutes after her car was left in the restaurant parking lot. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from the gas station and immediately spotted the red pickup truck their suspect had been driving. And when they checked the camera near the register, their suspicions were confirmed. It was the same man. Now they had proof that this person had Jessika's credit card, and that only made him look even more guilty. They released footage of the suspect and his vehicle to the news, asking the public for any information about this man. Meanwhile, detectives kept searching for more evidence, but they couldn't find any other leads. Days passed without any major breakthroughs, until they got a call from a woman named Leslie. She told them that the man in the footage looked a lot like her fiance's best friend, 29-year-old Crispin Harmel. But that wasn't all. According to Leslie, Crispin was supposed to stop by that evening to pay back the money he owed, but he never showed up. Later, when she saw the news report about Jessica's murder, she immediately recognized him in the surveillance footage. She couldn't believe he might be involved in something so horrific, but she still knew the right thing to do was call the police. Detectives began digging into Crispin's background and quickly uncovered an interesting detail. Just weeks before Jessica's murder, a patrol officer had pulled him over for driving with an expired license. When investigators reviewed the officer's body camera footage, they confirmed that Crispin closely resembled their suspect. Even more telling, he was wearing the exact same baseball cap as the man in the surveillance footage. 5 days after Jessica's murder, police went to Crispin's home. Right away, they noticed his pickup truck. It was the same model as the one caught on camera, but something was off. It looked like Crispin had made some cosmetic changes. Chrome details that had been visible in the footage were now painted over in black. When detectives knocked on his door, Crispin surprised them right away. Without hesitation, he admitted that he had met with Jessica that night. According to him, they connected through an adult website and had arranged to meet for a no-strings-attached hookup. Crispin claimed they met in the Walmart parking lot, where he got into Jessica's car. According to him, she then drove them to a park, where they had consensual sex before she dropped him back off at Walmart. Before he left, they sat in her car and talked for a while. He told her he was struggling financially, and according to his version of events, Jessica gave him her credit card so he could pay for gas. Then, they said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. The next day, when he saw news reports about Jessica's murder, Crispin said he panicked. Afraid he would be accused, he threw away the credit card and repainted parts of his truck. Even though Crispin told this story with confidence, detectives knew it was nothing but a lie. It looked like a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility. The surveillance footage alone was enough to tear his version apart. He claimed they had arranged to meet in the Walmart parking lot, yet he never approached Jessica until after she returned to her car. Then, he said she had driven him back after their supposed encounter, but the cameras told a different story. They clearly showed him walking back to his own truck alone. Jessica's car never moved from the parking lot until the next morning, and no one else had approached it. Detectives seized Crispin's phone and computer, along with Jessica's devices. As they suspected, there was no trace of any communication between them. No messages, no calls, nothing. In fact, Jessica had never even visited the adult website Crispin claimed they had used to arrange the meeting. But when investigators dug through Crispin's computer, they found something interesting. Just hours after police discovered Jessica's body, he had searched for and read multiple news articles about her murder. Jessica's friends and family didn't believe his story either. According to them, she wasn't the kind of person who would go looking for a one-night stand, let alone meet a total stranger in a parking lot in the middle of the night. That just wasn't who she was. On top of that, she had already told her friends she needed to get some sleep before her morning shift and that she still had to feed her dogs. There was no way she would have gone out for some secret late-night date. Investigators believed Crispin was doing everything he could to shift the blame, but with so much evidence stacked against him, there was no way he could come up with a believable excuse. Based on the surveillance footage, detectives pieced together what they believed really happened. Crispin likely spotted Jessica inside Walmart and targeted her. He followed her to her car, got in, and used threats to keep her from screaming or fighting back. From there, he may have forced her to drive to a nearby park, where he assaulted her before returning to the parking lot near Walmart, closer to his own truck. Before leaving, he strangled her and stole her wallet and credit cards. When police confronted Crispin with this version of events, he stopped answering questions and asked for a lawyer. Despite the strong evidence against Crispin, investigators faced a serious challenge, one that could put the entire case at risk. The fact that Jessica had remained alive for several hours after the attack created a major legal hurdle. The problem was that medical experts couldn't say with absolute certainty why this had happened. Cases like hers were so rare that medical science simply hadn't studied them in enough depth. As we know, the official cause of death was listed as strangulation. But until that point, there had never been a single documented case of someone being strangled, surviving for hours while walking and talking, and then dying later as a direct result of this attack. Because multiple witnesses had seen Jessika alive, the prosecutor wasn't confident that a jury would return a guilty verdict. The only thing that could truly seal the case was a confession, but Crispin refused to admit to anything. Detectives found themselves in an incredibly difficult situation. They were certain that Crispin was responsible for Jessika's murder. No one else could have physically committed the crime, but because she had remained alive until the morning, there was a real risk that the case would fall apart in court. Hoping to strengthen their case, investigators searched Jessika's car for any additional evidence, but they came up empty. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could directly tie Crispin to the crime scene. Still, prosecutors found a temporary solution. They charged him with evidence tampering in connection with Jessika's case. As we know, Crispin had admitted to throwing away her credit card and repainting his truck, both clear attempts to cover his tracks. Since they had his own words as proof, they at least had enough to hold him accountable for some crime while they continued working to build a stronger case. In May 2010, Crispin pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison for evidence tampering. But detectives had no intention of giving up. They were determined to get full justice for Jessika, and to do that, they needed solid scientific proof directly linking Crispin to her murder. For years, they kept searching without any progress. But then, in 2013, they came across a scientific article that changed everything. This article described cases where strangulation didn't immediately result in death, as it typically would. Instead, it triggered something known as delayed death syndrome, a condition where victims suffer brain damage that causes confusion, disorientation, and an inability to seek help. Everything in the article perfectly matched Jessika's behavior after the attack. It also supported the initial medical examiner's conclusion that she had likely suffered a brain injury, which left her unaware of her condition until it was too late. Detectives immediately contacted the author of this article and started building a murder case against Crispin, this time backed by cutting-edge medical science. In May 2014, Crispin was officially arrested for murder, but he continued to insist on his innocence. During the trial, his defense attorney focused on one key point. There was no DNA evidence linking Crispin to the crime. The prosecution had argued that Jessika had fought back during the attack and likely scratched her attacker, which should have left traces of DNA under her fingernails. However, forensic experts for the prosecution pointed out a crucial factor. Jessika had spent hours inside her car, trapped in extreme heat. At such high temperatures, DNA degrades rapidly, and by the time her body was examined, any genetic material under her nails would have already broken down beyond the point of recovery. In addition to the forensic evidence, prosecutors relied heavily on the overwhelming amount of surveillance footage, which clearly pointed to Crispin's guilt. But then, something unexpected happened. Crispin's lawyer questioned the accuracy of the video timestamps used by the prosecution. See, when investigators first got the footage straight from the security cameras, there were no timestamps on it. Since the exact timing of events was crucial to the case, prosecutors used specialized software to add them later. And that single detail gave the defense an opening to cast doubt on the evidence. Crispin's attorney argued that this was a serious violation because he had never been given copies of the surveillance footage with the added timestamps. In the end, the judge sided with the defense and was forced to declare a mistrial. Just like that, Crispin once again escaped conviction, all because of a technicality. However, he remained in prison, continuing to serve his 10-year sentence for evidence tampering. Meanwhile, prosecutors immediately began preparing for a new trial. Over the next few years, Crispin's legal team fought hard to prevent him from being retried, arguing that another trial would violate his rights. But in the end, a higher court ruled in favor of the prosecution, clearing the way for justice to finally be served. The new trial began in 2018, and this time, the prosecution made sure to cover every detail, leaving no room for the defense to exploit any technicalities. In the end, they succeeded in convincing the jury of Crispin's guilt, and he was finally convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors had chosen not to pursue the death penalty, fearing it might weaken their chances of securing a guilty verdict. They knew the delayed death syndrome argument could still plant doubts in the jurors' minds, and in death penalty cases, a conviction requires absolute certainty. A few years later, Crispin tried to appeal his sentence, but his request was denied. As a result, he remains behind bars with almost no chance of ever walking free. Jessika's family thanked investigators and prosecutors for their relentless pursuit of justice, even though it took 9 long years to reach a verdict. However, they also admitted that before the sentencing, they had hoped it might bring them some relief and closure. But in reality, no punishment for Crispin could ever truly ease their pain. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.